Chapter 13, Parts A and B of Aces Up. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Aces Up by Covington Clarke. Chapter 13, Parts A and B. The last of the big shows. The following morning had no dawning. A light rain had fallen during the night, and a heavy, obliterating fog arose from the wet earth, blanketing hill and valley alike. So dense was it that troops in the front lines, peeping over the top in anxious nervousness as they awaited the 0 hour, saw nothing but a wall of white that made the shell-tortured land before them more mysterious than any dream of battle ever fancied. What did it hold? Where were the German lines? And just what had been the effect of this 5-hour tornado of screaming shells? Machine guns, under cover of the fog, were boldly mounted on the trench parapets. They danced and chattered on their tripods as they pounded forth streams of lead upon the unseen enemy positions. 0 hour at last. Along the line officers blew shrill whistles, or some, calmer than the others, gave the signal with a confidently shouted, "Let's go!" Over the trench tops poured thousands of khaki-clad warriors, sallying forth in the most resolute endeavor ever attempted by American troops. They had not advanced 10 feet from the trenches before the fog swallowed them, magically, and many were never to retrace their steps. The big show they had so long waited for was here with an ear-splitting, nerve-wracking tempest of thundering guns. The big parade. Part B. At any other time the air forces would have stayed safely at home, not daring to take wing on such a day when the ceiling was scarcely higher than a man's head. But now they must go out, at any cost, blindly flying and vainly seeking some view of the advancing troops. But they went out singly, for to attempt formation flight on such a morning would be to court disaster and death. McGee and Larkin were the first of the squadron to take off for the front, the interval between their time of departure being sufficient to avoid any meeting as they climbed. The fog bank was much thicker than McGee had anticipated. At 100 feet he could not see a thing above, below, or on either side. He headed his new ship, a swift Spad, in the direction of Vauquois Hill, intending to cross the line there, and hoping that the crest of the hill might loom up out of the fog. Vain hope. It was impossible to see a thing. Any minute he might go plowing into some hillside or foul his landing gear in the tops of trees. It was eerie business, this flying by instinct and facing the dreaded possibility of coming a cropper. Several times he cut his motor, and at such times could hear the din of battle below, and it was not any too far below either. Added to the fear of crashing was the thought that at any second he might cross the path of a high-angle shell which had been directed at some enemy strong point. It was not a pleasant thought, but he could not shake it off. Certainly the air was full of them, and if he was to get any information as to the progress of the battle, he must keep low and accept all hazards. Then, too, there was the chance that he might meet up with some other plane drilling through the fog. "Well," he thought aloud, "I'm a poor prune if I lose my nerve now." I expressed my opinion of Siddons and G, how he'd like to be facing no more than this. It was a depressing, angering thought. 5 days, von Herzmann had said, then Siddons would face a firing squad. In the meantime, there was no human agency on the Allied side of the line that could stop the inexorable march of time, and the certain death which this man must meet. It was this latter fact, the feeling of helpless impotency, that fired McGee's brain with reckless daring, and sent him boring through the fog like an angry hornet. He soon found that this was of no avail, and at last, seeking something that might be of value, he climbed out of the earth-blanketing fog into the clear sunlight, encountering clear blue sky at some 1,500 feet. Below him now was a billowing sea of fog banks, tinted by the sun which had climbed about it. A short distance ahead he sighted an enemy triplane Fokker, but before he could give chase it had dived into the fog. Over to the right, in what he thought must be the general direction of Montfaucon, he saw a single-seater Nieuport cruising around. He headed for it, and soon identified it as Yancey's plane. The wild Texan was sitting above the fog, patiently waiting, as a cat waits for a mouse, for some observation sausage to come nosing out of the fog. Tex knew that the sun would eventually burn up the fog. The enemy, also knowing this, would be sending up their sausages so as to have them in position when the fog passed. Certainly the enemy had reason to see all that could be seen, for by this time they must be hard-pressed indeed. Directly in McGee's path, about halfway between his plane and Yancey's, a black, formless bulk loomed out of the fog. A sausage. McGee drove hard for it, and noted that he was in a race with Yancey, whose quick eye had sighted it. The black bag was hardly out of the fog bank when tracers from McGee's and Yancey's guns began streaming into it. It exploded with amazing suddenness, the flaming cloth sinking back into enveloping billows of fog. Yancey banked sharply, flew alongside McGee, and shook his fist, as though to say, "Go and find a rat hole of your own. This is my territory." McGee chuckled. The Texan, instead of trying to catch some view of the far-flung battle lines, was out to increase his score. McGee dived back down into the fog, hoping that it might be lifting. Down below, he knew, a mighty struggle was on. Lines of communication would be shot all to pieces in the rain of heavy shells. Great headquarters would be waiting anxiously for some news of the real status and progress of the battle. At 8:30, the fog was still holding over the field, and McGee reluctantly turned his ship homeward. By that sixth sense which the seasoned pilot has or develops, he found the field. No one had been able to catch sight of the ground forces. Cowan was storming around, under pressure from headquarters. "It's information we want," he told the pilots as they came in, "not a tale of what can't be done. Get back over the lines. This fog will pass. This is not a job for an hour. Headquarters wants information. Get it." To McGee, he said, with something of a sting in his voice, "Considering the chances Siddons used to take, I'd think this squadron, his own group, would be equal to this task." It was a lash. Furious, yet realizing the justice of the taunt, McGee again took off, determined not to come back until he could bring some real news of the battle's progress. End of Chapter 13. Parts A and B. Chapter 13, Parts C, D, and E of Aces Up. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Aces Up by Covington Clarke. Chapter 13, Parts C, D, and E. The last of the big shows. Part C. That was the longest, hardest day ever put in by American aviators. They had little trouble in gaining and holding their supremacy, but they had a most difficult time, when the fog finally lifted, in getting any accurate information. The advance had been so rapid and so successful that the Hindenburg line had been carried by the soldiers in the first few hours of battle. But in pressing forward, in the fog, they had been unable to keep close liaison. Instead of being a well-knit whole, they were little more than a storming, victory-drunk mob. They stopped at nothing, and nothing could stop them. As for displaying their white muslin panels to airplanes so that their positions might be known, poof! They were too busy to fool around with panels, and those dizzy airbirds who never did anything but fly around and look for panels. Panels be hanged. This was a day for doughboys and the bayonet. Part D. That night, after mess, the members of the squadron sat around in glum silence. The success of the day with reference to gains was great indeed, but Cowan was riding with whip and spur. He seemed not at all pleased with the work of his own group. Added to this, word had gone around of the dramatic happenings of the previous night, with the result that Siddons, the most disliked man in the squadron, had suddenly become their mourned hero. Even now they counted him as dead, for one precious day had already slipped away, and nothing in the world could save him. The success of the day seemed as nothing by the side of this tragic fact. Not the least distressing thought was the fact that they had treated him as one who had never earned the right to a full fellowship with them. And now they knew, too late, that he was a man of surpassing courage. They even learned from Cowan how Siddons, working with the French, had plotted trapping von Herzmann that day when the squadron was attacked for the first time. The lucky arrival of the French Spads, they now knew, was not a matter of luck at all, but a daring plan to overwhelm the greedy German war eagle and rid the air of him. Yes, Siddons had courage and brains. There was no longer any doubt of that. Yancey voiced the thoughts of every man present when he said, "It wouldn't be so tough if he could get it in the air, but this way, at a wall, is tough." "But what about von Herzmann?" Fouche asked. "I guess it was tough for him, too." Yancey grinned and scratched his head. "You know," he drawled, "down in my home state, we sometimes make a mistake and slap a brand on a calf that's not really ours. Well, that's not so awful. But when somebody else makes the same mistake, it's stealing. Pure and simple. War's a lot like that. We only see one side of it. And for my part, I'm fed up with seeing that side. Boy, I hone for Texas." Part E. McGee and Larkin, as flight leaders, had been called to Major Cowan's headquarters for the usual evening conference. The Major declared himself as displeased with the work of the day, but both of the young pilots experienced in the ways of the Army realized that Cowan's displeasure was but a reaction from pressure being put on him by the higher-ups. The General Staff, they knew, must be gratified with the success of the day, for all objectives had been taken and the enemy sorely pressed. It was true, however, that communication had been far from perfect. Liaison had broken down, and the ground gained, therefore, was the result of the grim determination of the soldier of the line to end the thing speedily rather than to a perfect coordination of all arms. "But, Major," McGee was defending the work of the squadron by pointing out the unusual and unforeseen obstacles, "we couldn't see our wingtips until after 9 o'clock, and when we could see, those doughboys wouldn't display their panels. They acted like they thought we would drop bombs on them. It's hard, Major, to get men to show white panels when they are under fire. They are afraid that the enemy will see them, too, and blow them off the face of the earth. It is always a hard problem." "All battle problems are hard," Cowan replied. "The commanders of the troops in the line are being ridden just as we are. The General Staff feels that victory is in sight. They will accept nothing but the best of work, and we must do our full share." "Yes, sir, of course, but I think the troops are to be congratulated for their success, and certainly this outfit was lucky in that we didn't hang any planes on the top of Vauquois or in the woods. 4 balloons and 3 EA is not such a bad record for a day like this. We held complete supremacy." "Congratulations will be in order after a complete success, Lieutenant. Now, for tomorrow. Here, see this map?" Larkin winked shrewdly as Cowan led them over to a detailed wall map. "The lines of departure are here. Our most advanced positions now, as near as we can tell, are well beyond the Hindenburg line, with the Hagen-Stelling line of defense facing our troops tomorrow. Montfaucon, the enemy's strongest point, and for months headquarters for the Crown Prince, blocks the way for the 5th Corps. It is a commanding and strong position. No one knows just how strong it is." "Pardon me," a voice came from directly behind them, "but I know a great deal about its strength." So interested had they been, they had not heard anyone enter. At the sound of the voice, they wheeled around. There stood Siddons, mud from head to foot, but smiling expansively. "Siddons!" Cowan exclaimed. "You?" "Yes, sir, fortunately." All 3 of the startled men rushed forward to wring his hand. There was a hubbub of excited talk and exclamations of surprise, with no chance for the mind to put forth logical questions. Cowan was the first to gain some degree of composure. "Heavens, man! How did you get here?" "Crawled, walked, and ran, and the last few miles in a sidecar," Siddons replied. "Last night, at midnight, I was being held at Montfaucon under the trumped-up pretext that a staff officer was on his way to see me, and that I was to take off with von Herzmann later in the night. But I knew that von Herzmann had taken off with another pilot, and I knew that the jig was up. They weren't accusing me of anything, as yet, but they were very quiet, and their manner told me all I needed to know. Then, bing, the barrage opened up. It was some surprise. They hadn't the foggiest notion that a blow was to be struck here. Almost the first pop out of the box, that long-range railway rifle at Neuvilly dropped one of those big GI cans just outside of headquarters. There was a grand scramble for the deep dugouts. You never saw so many high ones streaking it for safety. I made tracks too, but I missed the dugout door by design. Pretty soon another big shell came along and flopped down near the same place, but by that time I was a long ways from there and going strong. The night was as dark as the inside of a whale, but the glare of light from the guns on our side gave me direction. The rest was comparatively easy." "Easy!" Cowan exclaimed. "How in the world did you get across the line?" "Major, the confusion was so great, due to that barrage, that I could have led an elephant up to the line with no one taking the time to challenge me. You forget that my German is quite good. On a dark night, well covered by a German officer's coat, which I borrowed from a chap who won't ever need it again, it was not a difficult feat. Believe me, my biggest worry was that I would get sent west by one of our own shells. When I reached the front line, I crawled in a funk hole and waited for dawning and for our own troops to come along. And when they started, man, how they came! The enemy is completely disorganized, Major, and victory will be ours within a month or 6 weeks. Maybe sooner. The Germans know it. Montfaucon will fall tomorrow. This is the last of the big shows." He paused, and his eyes, which McGee had always thought so cold, twinkled with merriment. "By the way," he said, "at division headquarters of the 79th, where I made a report and was given transportation back here, the intelligence officer told me a spy was nabbed last night, a chap by the name of von Herzmann. Plane forced down, the officer told me. I wonder if it could be possible that he ran out of gas." "Yes," Cowan replied, catching the spirit of the banter. "He ran out of gas." "Tut, tut," Siddons mockingly reproved. "Wasn't that a careless thing for a great ace to do?" End of chapter 13, parts C, D, and E.